Welcome to our second talk in our Tombs of the Isles talk series, Death and Burial in Neolithic Orkney, Part 2, with Professor Colin Richards. If you'd like to find out more, please visit our website at archaeologyorkney.com/Tombs of the Isles. I'd like to warn you that this talk contains images of human remains in skeletal form.
In the second talk on Neolithic Orkney and its chambered tombs, I want to look first of all at who goes into the tombs, and that's the burials and the mortuary practices which surround those. And after we've looked at that, I want to look at the appearance of a new form of architecture, the passage grave, which appears in Orkney around 3200, but is related to a much wider spread of monuments elsewhere. In order to explore the nature of burial and mortuary practices, I want to look at a particular area and focus attention on Rousay, which is quite an unusual island in having a large number of tombs, particularly on its southern side. And by looking at these, we might get some insight into the complexities that occur within these tombs. A good point of departure is now of Maeshowe, which is on a higher terrace overlooking the stretch of water between mainland and Rousay. The tomb is a typical stalled cairn with 4 compartments and arranged in this linear fashion that we see with the stalled cairns. When it was looked at, excavated back in the 1930s, it was found to contain some rather unusual deposits. Along the central area running through the monument was spreads of human skeletal material, long bones and things like that. But at the end compartments, they found rows of skulls, all against the wall, facing inside. And the thing about them was that the skulls had clearly come from elsewhere, or some of them had, because they were very different. Some were decayed, some were scorched, and they weren't the same as the next one. So they've been brought in and placed in these extraordinary positions. The next tomb we want to look at is now Rousay, and that's further to the west. It's slightly higher than Maeshowe, lying up above now of Larrow. It was excavated initially because it was thought to be a croft or a cottage, but then it was found to be a chambered tomb. It was quite long. I think it's got the longest compartments of all the Rousay cairns, but it only contained 3 burials, or the remains of 3 people. And here's a picture of the skeletal parts which were there. So that begged the question, were these put in as 3 individuals and the bones which aren't there are simply decayed? Or were different parts of people put in? Or again, could it be that people were put in and they had bones removed? Slightly lower down on the terraces is yet another stalled cairn called Blackhammer. This is a little bit different because the entrance actually comes in from the side. So this means rather than having one long linear space, you enter it and you've got the choice of going left or right. But in each case, the same imagery is presented of the stalls. Now this only contained 2 people, and one of them was very, very close, if not in the entrance itself. And so this is a large tomb, and yet it only has 2 bodies. And as you can see, there's only parts of those bodies. So the same questions again. Were 2 people put in complete and their bones removed, or did they decay, or was it just the bones that were put in? In order to address these questions, let's move on to yet another Rousay cairn, Midhowe, which is situated on the shore down on the southern side of Rousay. It's a very long stalled cairn, and it was excavated in the 1930s by Walter Grant. And its contents actually start to give us some insight as to what mortuary practices are occurring in these terms to give us those sorts of skeletal information that we've seen in the other cairns. When Midhowe was excavated, a number of shelves were found between the stalls, that's the orthostat sticking out from the walls, along the right-hand side and tending to occur towards the rear of the tomb. And when this was excavated and the rubble removed, the remains of some 27 individuals were found either on the shelves or beneath them. The largest number of burials found as yet on Rousay. Even though this was being excavated in the 1930s, when the excavation techniques weren't as sophisticated as those we employ now, it was really very well excavated. And looking at the burials, we start to see some very different types. So first, some of them were articulated, that is, the bones were arranged in such a way that shows that the corpse was lying there, the flesh rotted off, and what we're seeing is the skeletal remains in situ. In other instances, the burials were clearly not articulated, but were disarticulated. That is, they'd been moved and the bones rearranged. And what was noticed was that there were small groups of these. And it looked on careful examination as though what had happened is a body had been put in, the flesh had rotted off, and when the new interment was being put in, the older bones were pushed to the back, stacked, and in some instances the skull placed on top. Now we're looking at a diagram of those burials, and you can see the articulated burials on the shells, you can see some of the bones stacked at the back, and in some instances bones have been removed and placed underneath the shells. So what does this actually represent? What are we looking at here? Well, it seems as if we've got complete bodies being put in. After the flesh has decayed, the bones are being collected and pushed to the side to allow new interments to be put on the shells. So here we might be seeing a sequence of burial, perhaps of a particular group, perhaps over a series of years, maybe even centuries. So judging from Midhowe, we've got a rough idea of what goes on. That is, complete bodies are being put into the tombs, and once the flesh has decayed, the bones are either being left where they are, or they're being moved to the side. So who is it that's actually going into these monuments? Here we can introduce a really amazing development that's occurred over the last few years, that of ancient DNA. And it's slow and it's early, but we have got some very interesting evidence from chamber tombs further south. For instance, at Hasselton in the Cotswolds. This was excavated back in the 1970s, and the ancient DNA evidence has shown what you're getting is a family group, but the kinship is rather strange because you've got one male and then you've got 4 females that he's in turn bred with, and the offspring of those unions are actually put into different chambers within the chamber tomb. So we're starting to see some really quite explicit evidence of different forms of kinship. This ancient DNA evidence or analysis has yet to be done for the Orkney tombs, but of course that's going to be very exciting when it occurs, and that'll be very soon. So what can we now say? Well, we can now say, yes, we kind of understand what's going on in these tombs with bodies going in over a certain period, and only after the flesh is rotted are the bones moved and so on. But if we think sites like Maeshowe and Blackhammer and Rousay, it's quite clear that bones are actually being moved around between the tombs. So we've got 2 different processes going on. We've got the actual interment and decay of individual people, and then at a later time, we've got to some degree, maybe their bones are being moved around, particularly the skulls seem to be a focus of attention. If you recall that strange arrangement in Maeshowe of the skulls arranged around the inner chamber, all looking inwards. This may account for some of the variability we see in the numbers of individuals in the Orcadian chambered tombs, because we can't really trust the evidence, because not only have we got something going on like at Midhowe, we know in other tombs there's parts of individuals which have been moved around. So it's quite difficult for us to work out from the excavated remains of the cairns exactly what's going on. But let's turn to Quoyness. Quoyness and Isbister, as you probably saw in the last diagram, stand out as being different, with potentially several hundred people being buried, or certainly their bones being found within the chambers. Quoyness is a passage grave, which I'll talk about in a minute. It was excavated in 1972 by Colin Richards, and was the first passage grave to be excavated under modern conditions, but also a passage grave which is fairly intact. That is, it hadn't really been disturbed too much by antiquarians. When excavated, Renfrew found some really interesting evidence, and we can go through the sequence now. So the first thing to happen within the chamber are 3 kists being built. Now this itself is really amazing, because kist burial is normally thought to occur at the end of the 3rd millennium, starting around 2400. But this gives us direct evidence that individuals were being buried in kists in the base of passage graves around 3000, well, between 3200 to 3000 BC. And these are complete burials, crouched, being put in these kists or boxes with a big slab put on the top. The taphonomic conditions, that's the environmental conditions within the chamber itself, vary considerably. So in one kist you had a crouched male skeleton, but in the kist right next to it, all the bone had decayed. Directly above the kists and completely covering them was an incredible deposit. It was a mass of disarticulated bone, human bones. There was no evidence of skeletons, of what we would say articulated remains. It was a complete mess. There was no articulation whatsoever, looking as if these bones had either been completely rearranged and moved around and disturbed, or else they'd actually come in as individual bones and literally been piled in the chamber. Whichever way, there was near on 200 individuals represented by these bones. So where is this bone coming from? One possibility is it's actually been taken from other tombs and brought to Quoyness. Of course, the other possibility is that originally there were large numbers of articulated and disarticulated remains in Quoyness, but in the Iron Age, because there's an Iron Age roundhouse built right next to it, and it's quite clear that people were going in during the Iron Age, this is what, 2,000 years later, may have disturbed the deposits to the extent we see today. I'm inclined to think that actually there's a little bit of both. There was disturbance, and I also think bones were perhaps coming in from other tombs, being collected in one place under the control of a particular group. So we might be seeing the development of a particular hierarchy. But apart from that, I just want to move on to looking at passage graves themselves, because they're quite a different form of monument from the stalled cairns. And so we should expect what's going on in them to be a little bit different as well. Of all the Orcadian passage graves, the most famous is Maeshowe. It's renowned for its very sophisticated masonry and monumental internal architecture. But of course, the thing which is characteristic of these sites and why they're called passage graves is because the passages themselves are really long. Now, this lengthening of the passage has been argued by people like Neil Sharples to be a consequence of the chambered tomb being brought closer to the living. Now, in the case of Maeshowe, we know it's very close to Barnhouse, and more recently, field walking has discovered another settlement right next to it. So is the lengthening of the passage a consequence of a close proximity to the living? I think this interpretation is quite valid, although it must be said that some passage graves do or are situated on hillsides or right on the edge of the land by the sea. But let's take Sharple's argument at face value and think that, yes, for some reason, the dead are being brought into closer proximity to the living. So what are they like? Well, as it turns out, there was very little skeletal material found in Maeshowe on excavation. Petrie records trampled skulls into the clay floor, so it may have had skulls within its interior. But it's got this characteristic, what we call cruciform architecture. So you see the passage coming in, there's a right and left cell, and the cell at the end. So in plan, you do have this sort of cruciform shape. And also, on each corner, you've got standing monoliths, which is very different from any other passage grave in Orkney. Another aspect which makes Maeshowe stand out as being different is that its passage is orientated to the southwest, and as we know, it's actually aligned with the midwinter solstice. So when the sun sets at the shortest, coldest, darkest day of the year, the sun, if it's shining, flows down the passage and illuminates the interior. What makes this a little bit interesting is there's actually a blocking stone which has just a small gap above it, which allows the sun a shaft of light to come into the interior. Whether or not this shaft of light is actually awakening the ancestors at a particular time of year, because from that point on, the light suddenly increases and we enter spring, a period of fertility. But thinking more broadly about passage graves, they do occur outside Orkney. They occur in different parts of the sort of western side of Scotland, but also Ireland, parts of Anglesey, that's Wales, and even in the Channel Islands, and you even find some in Brittany. So all of a sudden, with the passage graves, we find direct linkage between Orkney and other parts of Britain, Ireland, and Western France. And is this representative of an expansion, of a communication, and maybe movement of people during the late Neolithic? So we're talking about the period around 3200 to 2800 BC. And let's just look at the Irish monuments for a second. And of course, the most famous equivalent to Maeshowe in Ireland is Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. And unlike Maeshowe, it's absolutely enormous. The other thing that Newgrange is so famous for is its fabulous megalithic art. Now, in Maeshowe, there are a few scratch decorations, but nothing on the scale or the sort of curvilinear passage grave art that you find in Newgrange. Now, interestingly, where you do find this sort of art is in Peerwell Quarry Tomb on Westray. And I find this quite extraordinary, actually, because if someone said, where would you expect to find this fabulous art in Orkney? I think most people would say, oh, it should be in the Stennis Brodgar area, that is Maeshowe or one of the other monuments. But no, it's actually on Westray. So what this gives us a little bit insight of how perhaps social relationships and communication between islands and beyond islands may not have been as straightforward as we think. If we look at the internal architecture of Newgrange, we find that it's a very similar form of design to that we saw at Maeshowe. You can see it's got a long passage leading to a cruciform chamber. And perhaps more amazingly, we see another linkage between Maeshowe and Newgrange, in that at Newgrange, the winter solstice sun shines directly up the passage, but in this instance, it's the rising sun as opposed to the setting sun. You could almost make an interpretive link that the two sites are interrelated in a calendrical manner. That is, Newgrange marks the morning or the rising sun of midwinter, and Maeshowe marks the evening and the setting of the sun. If we go further afield, another fabulous, monumental, huge passage grave is Lahogue B on Jersey. It's so big. It's the same sort of size as Newgrange, but it's so big that a chapel is built actually on its summit. And once again, if we start to look at the architecture of this monument, we find that we have the long passage and we have a cruciform chamber. And it's quite interesting to ponder why we're seeing the same form of architecture over such huge distances between, say, the Channel Islands right the way up to the north of Britain to Orkney. There's one other thing which links these monuments, and that is we actually visited Lahogue B. I took some students there, and one of the things we noticed was it was composed of different types of stone, and on further investigation, geological work back in the 1920s and 30s showed that this stone is coming from different parts of the island. And we wondered whether we were actually seeing earlier monuments being dismantled and some of the stones being brought down and incorporated in this single large monument. There is also other good evidence that the same sort of phenomenon is occurring elsewhere. So in Newgrange, we find some of the stones there have decorations strangely different on the backs of the stones, also different types of stones. So just as in Hoe B, is it possible that different stones from earlier monuments in different places are being brought and reassembled? And if we just think briefly about Maeshowe, we think, oh goodness, it's got those large standing stones in its architecture, and yet it's also, most of the other masonry is blocky with some longer elements as you get nearer the top. And we know some of this comes from Stony Hill, just about a mile or so to the northwest. But could it be that even Maeshowe is actually being built of dismantled earlier monuments? It's a possibility. But let's think about where these passage graves occur in Orkney. And we see you'll find on the side of hills, you might find them by the seashore, and of course when we thought about Maeshowe, we find them inland locations next to settlements. Some good examples of passage grave location on the sides of hills. It's Wideford Hill, Quoyness on mainland, whereas Quoyness, whilst it's on the hillside, it's actually been brought down. And of course, as it turns out, Quoyness has a longer passage. A good example of a coastal passage grave is Quoyness on Sanday. This was excavated by Gordon Child, actually, in the 1950s. Just along from it is another probable passage grave called St Ugman's Howe, and that's placed so close to the sea that on the high tide has got into it, and it's actually wrecked and ruined the chamber. So these coastal passage graves are literally being built between the land and the sea in a sort of ambiguous area, a liminal zone, as we would say. In contrast, a good example of a hillside passage grave is Wideford Hill, or just across further to the west, Quoyness Hill. Now, curiously, we were talking about contents earlier on. When Wideford Hill was excavated, it had no human bones, and Quoyness Hill had just 5 skulls. What does this tell us? It tells us that actually these monuments were being used differently, and I think it also tells us that parts of bodies were being moved between monuments and beyond monuments, even in the passage graves themselves. So just further to the west is a very similar monument, that's Quoyness passage grave. It too is up on the side of the hill. Notice it's not on the summit, it's about 2/3 of the way up. So why are they selecting this location? One answer may be the way they are visible from the settlements. So down below this particular monument, Quoyness, is the settlement of Stonehall, and it's a settlement that carries on through the Neolithic, so it's contemporary with the monument. Now the interesting thing is, the position of Quoyness is the only location it could have been where it's skylined against the side of the hill. And you have to wonder then what the relationship is between the passage grave and the living. It's an ever presence to their lives. They're always aware that it's overlooking what they're doing and where they're living. And if it's their ancestors, it's a very watchful eye. And it is a curious situation that given the large number of passage graves there are, how little human burials there are within them, with the exception of Quoyness. So what does this tell us as well? This tells us again that these different monuments are being used in different ways, and the search for a unitary or single form of mortuary practice and a similar treatment of the dead across Orkney and even within chambered tombs in very close proximity is an illusion. They're being used very differently, and they have very different histories. The building and use of passage graves really draws the era of the chambered tomb to an end. And indeed, if we think back to the first deposits, the base deposits in the main chamber at Quoyness, what do we find? We find 3 single inhumations in 3 individual kits. And it's this form of burial that's now going to be the main form of mortuary practice in Orkney as we run through the 3rd millennium BC. What makes the Orcadian evidence that little bit more interesting is this single burial in kists seems to start much earlier in Orkney than it does anywhere else in Britain, because you tend to think of single burial in kists or in pits associated with the Beaker people who are coming in around 2400. So once again, things are occurring in Orkney a little bit earlier than they are elsewhere. Now we return to that initial question that was asked right at the beginning of these talks. What are chamber tombs, and what is the role of the dead? Well, given our discussion or looking at the proximity of the tombs to the living and where they're situated in the landscape, they are a constant presence in the lives of the living people. We're not seeing the total dead of Neolithic Orkney in these tombs, so where else are people being buried? I think it's quite possible that people have been buried in the sea. Or it may well be that we simply haven't found these underground burial places like Cranted near Kirkwall, where other people are being buried. What we do know is from places like Midhowe, it does look like we're seeing a process of people being put into single tombs, and perhaps if we think of that ancient DNA evidence, it may well be particular kin groups who are going into these tombs. Subsequently, after the flesh has decayed, the bones may be even moved in within the tomb, or they may be taken out of the tomb and placed somewhere else. And that may be the reason we find so much disarticulated bone in Quoyness. Whatever the role of the chambered tomb and whatever the role of the dead, this is one of the most important monumental forms in the early Neolithic. In fact, when you think of the early Neolithic, you think of the great burial monuments. The living are living in timber structures or stone buildings, far less conspicuous. It's the dead and the ancestors which really are the main emblem and the main manifestation in the early Neolithic.
We hope you enjoyed this talk on Death and Burial in Neolithic Orkney, Part 2. We hope you will join us for the next talk by Dr. Antonia Thomas on the subject of art and archaeology in Neolithic